you're not thinking wealthy enough. That's your problem. There was an episode where, with one house in particular that stuck in my head, which is that it actually had like a little annex building with a recording studio in. And I think it was owned by the guitarist or something from Roxy Music, which is some sort of band that is way before my time. And it had this little recording studio. I think Paul Weller was recording an album in there like the week before they were doing this tour of the house. And that's the one that stuck in my head. And I was thinking about this and I was like, the reason it stuck in my head is because there's a bit of a story behind it, right? It was owned by this musician and music producer. It's got a different feature to it, right? It's got a recording studio. None of the others had a recording studio. So it has that point of difference.
The gurus tell you to position your product within a particular niche in order to be successful. But my guest today, Joe Daniels, says that's wrong. It's better to craft a strategic narrative. Get ready, because during the show, he does a live exercise with me. He goes to my website, tells me what's wrong with the messaging, tells me what's missing. If you're a marketer or a business owner that's trying to grow your business, I think you're going to like this one. Also, special shout out to B2B Pod Pros that makes this podcast possible. If you're a SaaS company looking to reach new audiences and drive high quality leads, you can get on our waitlist at b2bpodpros.com. All right, let's hop into the conversation with Joe. Joe, welcome to Innovators Can Laugh. How are you doing today?
Hey, yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Okay, rapid fire questions here. The first one is, what is a favorite TV show that you can watch again and again?
How I Met Your Mother, the sitcom, like sort of like the millennial Friends, I guess. That's, I always could go back to that one.
Cool. What is an unusual thing you do to wow clients, to wow them?
I always ask personal details, right? Like I always kind of want to get to like them as a person rather than just them as a job, if that makes sense. So like, instead of just talking about, oh, how's work? Oh, what are you doing this weekend? You know, what do you do for fun? So I'll drill down into their life behind the screen.
Yeah. No, it's a good way to build rapport. I found that here in Eastern Europe, it's a little bit harder to build rapport versus back in the States.
Oh,
it's
really?
A little bit different. Yeah.
A bit more closed off.
Okay, one more here. What was a favorite childhood toy you played with?
Oh, I don't know whether you know of the film Small Soldiers. It was basically a film about these little toy action hero things that were actually alive in some way that I can't really remember. Like, it's set in the real world, but there's these toys that come to life and fight. There's two warring factions, and one of them was the leader of this monster faction. It was called, I want to say something along the lines of Archagon or something. I had a little toy, one of these, that could talk when you pressed his little thing, and you could move him around, play with him. Loved that. We played with that all the time. I think we were basically inseparable. He was my only friend. He was my only friend growing up.
Okay, I'm going to look for that, because I got a 7-year-old son, and I think he would be into that movie.
I'll find a link for you and send it over at some point.
Okay, last rapid fire question for you. What do Aristotle, Shakespeare, and you have in common?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So we all kind of developed our own narrative frameworks, right? So Aristotle has his, I think he was the 3-act one, right? I think he was like, we've got the 3 acts, beginning, middle, end sort of thing. Shakespeare then sort of took it further and went, oh, actually, let's give it 5 acts, and here's how it all works with his plays. It's been ages since I did English literature, so I can't tell you any more than that. And then I've got my own. I have my own narrative framework that I use with clients. It doesn't involve any acts.
No acts.
But hopefully it's still useful.
One thing I saw in your post is that it's like niche versus narrative. And you're saying that the general advice out there is to position your product within a particular niche, but you say you should focus on something you call narrative positioning. Can you give an example, and what does a narrative need?
So I guess the first thing is, like, I position it as this battle between the two, and it kind of is, but the reality is you kind of need both levels stacked on top of each other. I think it's still helpful to niche down as much as you can. But that used to be considered like the silver bullet, right? It's like, oh, all you need to do is pick a niche and you're going to win. It's like, well, I don't think that's the case anymore, because, if you named a niche right now, I bet you anything there's multiple competitors in that niche. So like, it's just the nature of SaaS, right? Is that there's so many that you're still going to have competition. And so what narrative does is it kind of adds a layer on top and goes, well, okay, how do we, in that niche, take ownership of it with something that goes beyond just being in that niche, if that makes sense. So you asked for an example. A couple of examples spring to mind. A classic one is Drift. which I'm sure you'll have heard of. Most of the listeners probably have heard of. And what Drift did was they were in the chat widget space back when everyone had a little chat bot in the corner of the website. And there were multiple tools that could do that, right? There were multiple tools that could put a little chat bot there. Intercom was another big one at the time. And what Drift did, and a lot of people say Drift created a category. I don't think that's technically true because no one said, oh, they're a conversational marketing tool, which is the thing that they coined. They still said they were a chat widget thing. But what they did was, instead of niching, right, if they'd gone with the old way, they would have niched down and would have said, we're a chat widget. They would have chosen some random niche, let's say accountants, and gone, we're the chat widget for accountants. Great, we're going to win the accountants market. And they might have won the accountants market. But then it's like, but that's quite small compared to the full market that they could have had. How do you then expand outwards, right? They would have been stuck because Intercom, meanwhile, would have gone, oh, yeah, well, we do this market, this market, this market. It's almost like just sharing out the spoils sort of thing. And so what Drift did was they went, well, why don't we go to market with some kind of narrative? And they saw that what the chat widgets did was almost enable a new avenue of marketing, which they called conversational marketing. And they kind of pitched that against the villain, so to speak, which was not having those conversations with customers and kind of almost pitching to them rather than talking with them, right? And so they went to market with a narrative that they positioned their product around. And it meant that people bought into that concept, that movement. And then, obviously, if you bought into that, you're going to then use Drift as the product. So it makes sense that their product is the best one to use for that. So that was a classic example.
Let's do a real live exercise right here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Why don't you go to my website, b2bpodpros.com, and just take a look at my messaging on the very front page here. And tell me if you think if I'm falling more into like a narrative positioning or if my messaging just sucks. And I've played around with different headlines before. And for those listening, on the homepage, the main message is, we don't just sell ad spots, we create a new growth channel for you.
So we don't just sell ad spots, we create a new growth channel for you. I think what's interesting is you've kind of started to lean into a narrative, which I see a lot, is people kind of dabbling in it. But I think you could probably go further, because my first question is like, what's wrong with just selling ad spots, right? Like, why is that a bad thing? Because here, that's your villain that you're hinting at, right? Is we don't just sell ad spots,
right? But
what you've done, and this, I see this a lot, and so it's everyone does this, is you've kind of then gone straight, when you scroll down, gone straight to how we contribute to your sales pipeline and spoke about you and your solution, and you've not really given any time to introduce the villain. If you think about all your favorite movies where the villain often steals the show, but the reason they do that is because you have a few scenes towards the start of that movie where they show the villain doing villainous things. They show Darth Vader chopping through people using the Force to get to Princess Leia, right? Because you need to see that he exists and that he's bad and mean and scary, because then the rest of it has that context behind it. If it had just started with a whiny little farm boy just running around a desert planet, you'd kind of be like, oh, okay, cool. What are the stakes here? Like, why don't you just stay on the farm? Now you know that there's a big villain. You're like, well, we have to take that villain down. And I think that's what you're missing currently, is that
I love this. I love this. So I got it. It's missing, like, what's wrong with if that makes sense. No, I love this, because you said that obviously the villain's missing and people don't know what's so bad about just ad spots. So I need to have, in section 2, a good visual and messaging, like, well, this is what's wrong with it. And that's completely missing. Thank you so much for that free consultation. That was the price. That was the price you paid for being on the show.
We're even now, right?
You did send me this graphic that showed niche versus narrative positioning and what are the benefits of the two. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that and why you think it's so much better for a brand to have a narrative position.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the first thing to say is to start with the niche positioning and what that does well. And what that does well is it goes, instead of taking on all of the market at once, let's pick one tiny segment of the market and focus in on them first. And I think that first is the crucial bit, because yes, you can build a business just in one, my business, and same as yours, is aimed at one niche type of buyer. I could make a healthy living just staying in that niche. And actually, the plan is to just stay in that niche, right? I can get the expertise. But that's also because there's only so many customers I can have. But with SaaS, it's a bit different, because actually SaaS scales, right? By design, you could have millions of customers using your platform. It almost seems silly to say, well, let's stick in that niche forever, because it's like, well, what about all of these? Are these not valid use cases outside of your niche? They probably are. And so it's like, well, why would you not want to expand over time? And so what niche positioning does is it goes, we do X for Y. Great, cool.
Right.
But when you want to expand out of that, your positioning is then hindering that expansion, right? So where the narrative comes in is it goes, well, actually, if, with Drift's example of conversational marketing, that can apply to multiple niches. So actually, as they expand outwards with their marketing and sales efforts and growth efforts, that narrative doesn't actually need to change that much. It might flex slightly according to the audience, but the underlying principle is the same. So it's able to adapt to new markets and opportunities that come up over time. So that's one of the benefits of narrative, is the sort of longevity of it. But then there's also the kind of, it steps a lot more into the brand marketing side, right? So people love stories, like stories are one of the first things that humans ever did, right? It's how we communicated with cave paintings and sitting around campfires and eating steaks that we've hunted. Yeah, just like you throw spears, tell a story about how you caught the pig, the good old days. And but the reason for that is because stories stick in your head. I saw a stat somewhere, I can't remember the source, but it was like things presented in a story format remembered 22 times more or something than just facts. Right. Our brains are hardwired to remember stories. If the whole point of positioning is to own a place in people's minds, not just in the market, then you want to do that with a story, because that's what's going to stick. It also resonates on a more emotional level. It's one thing to go, oh, this is what our product does, here's our capabilities. It's like, well, if you can express those same capabilities in the form of a story and in the form of a problem and a villain and so on, then it's speaking to them on an emotional level as well as rational. So it's kind of that two-pronged approach to really sort of hammer home the message. And then what's the other things I've said? I think I've said something along the lines of it starts a movement around your product. And I think that's, again, with the Drift example, the conversational marketing was a movement, right? It was, let's do something differently. The new way is good.
Yeah.
Join our movement, become an evangelist for us. And so people would go, be proud to like, oh yeah, we're part of this movement of conversational marketing. And so they almost end up doing the marketing for you as well, because they belong to this movement and this community rather than just, oh, I'm a customer of this product.
Yeah, and the old way could be a villain. So like my villain is obviously the large ad networks. And I think you said that there's 3 types of villains that you can choose. One was like the status quo sloppiness villain. Tell us about that one, and then the other 2 that you coined as well.
Yeah, sure. So status quo, when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is the old way to a certain extent. It's just that what often happens, depending on the maturity of the market and your category, the old way could be completely different to your platform, right? So it's kind of an indirect competitor. Traditionally, someone's using a spreadsheet to track their data, and you come up with a tool that does that for you, then the spreadsheet is the status quo. Spreadsheet's the old way. And obviously then your narrative would basically be like, why are you still using spreadsheets? Spreadsheets are bad for this reason and this reason. Like all of these headaches you get from spreadsheets, we can solve that with our platform that does it all for you, kind of thing, right? That's obviously a basic idea, basic framework. So you're fighting against an indirect competitor. And that's often the case for early stage markets, emerging markets, where there isn't much direct competition. It's kind of a whole new thing that you're doing. So there's not much other tools that do it, but your job then is to convince them to leave the old method of doing it behind. That's the status quo one. Then in the middle, you've kind of got what I call category norm confusion. Category norm is essentially, the category is a bit more established. So I don't know, CRMs, there's loads of those, right? There's an established market. People know what CRMs are. They probably already use one. So it's not like they're using a spreadsheet for this. They're probably using some kind of CRM tool. What your job then is to do as someone and trying to win over part of that market is to go, well, what's wrong with CRMs at the moment? What are some of the things we take for granted, the norms of this category that actually are probably hindering customers' ability to do what they want to do? They're the category norms that you then need to fight against. Most CRMs force you to, manually update your data. Well, we have this AI widget that actually automatically pulls in all the conversations you've had and transcribes them and stuff. Like it's essentially fighting against the villain becomes something that is normal in your industry but shouldn't.
Yeah,
I suppose is the idea. And then the third one
and
is
that's a tough one, because when I think of Asana, I always think of like Trello, Asana, Monday, and to me they're kind of just all the same. I mean, I don't even use any of them, but I feel like they're kind of just the same. So that's a tough.
I think the reason is because, to be fair, like, and obviously I'm biased to say this is the reason, but like, it's because they don't have a narrative, right? Like, you just know them all for what they do and their capabilities. And their capabilities are the same, like you just said, right? They do the same thing. If Asana came out and said, actually, look, the way these tools work is broken because of this. And so we've decided to pivot and do something slightly differently here with our product. Well, then Asana would stick out of those tools, right? You'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, so I can see why Asana are different because of this narrative.
Yeah.
And so it might not be you choose Asana for that reason, because it might not resonate with you. You might not need it, but you will at least acknowledge that they're different to the others. And so I think that's a good example of what happens when you don't have a narrative, right? Is that you do kind of blur in with all the others. The key thing to remember here as well with this one is that you're fighting against a concept, right? Instead you're going, all these tools, they do this. We do this differently. You're fighting against a concept, not a competitor. But then
it's not David versus Goliath. Yeah.
Which is nice, because that's the segue to the last of those three villains, which is that, right? So that's where I call this one market leader malaise. Malaise being a really fancy word for like a boredom and tiredness and so on. The concept here is essentially that David versus Goliath that you've just said. So here it's like there's a clear market leader, clear front runner. You just want to kind of nibble at them as the sort of small fish in this new pond and go, oh, you know what though? We could take some of their market share. And then you need a narrative to do that, because the default in this world is just pick that one. And I think a good example of this would be a tool called Butterdocs. I don't know if you've heard of those. So they are essentially a Google Docs alternative, and they market themselves as a Google Docs alternative. Like the first thing they call out is that they are an alternative to Google Docs. What they could have done is they could have niched down. They could have gone, we're the Google Docs kind of thing, but for accountants. I don't know why I always choose accountants, but there you go. The Google Docs for accountants.
You're trying to pick something safe, like everybody knows what an accountant is. That's a good example.
Yeah, hopefully.
yeah. DuckDuckGo is another good example. Have you heard of DuckDuckGo, the search engine? The alternative, like if you don't want to be tracked everywhere. Exactly.
So that's an example. And what Butterdocs do is they say Google Docs is chaotic. That's the word they use. They say Google Docs is just completely chaotic as an environment to write in and to create in. We wanted to do something better that wasn't chaotic.
Yeah.
And that's their narrative. Their narrative is, oh, look at us, we're taking on the big boys, Google. Help join us. It's a really interesting narrative, because you are calling out a competitor directly, but the only reason you can get away with it is because that gulf is so big between Butterdocs and Google Docs. If you're in a pond and there's a few fish swimming around that are the same size as you, you're probably not going to try and nick their food, because they're going to fight you, and you might not win that fight because you're all a similar size. If you try and sort of swim around a shark as your little fish, and kind of just, there are fish that do this, they kind of follow along and sort of pick up some of the detritus that the shark leaves behind. The shark's like, I don't care about that little fish, I'm too big. But it means that they're not going to just swallow you whole, and you don't have to, like they almost ignore you. And that's the advantage you have, I suppose, is by taking them on.
It's like a lion. He's not going to waste his energy. He's going to go after it.
Exactly. So the mouse would be smart to just follow alongside the lion and just have a little nibble every now and then at the food that's left behind.
And chaotic is
until they can take the lion on.
Exactly. And chaotic, I don't know about if that's the right word. I mean, when you were telling me this, I'm thinking chaos. Well, for me, chaos is trying to juggle two kids at home while working full time and, managing meetings and stuff. So I don't think Google Docs is chaotic from my perspective.
Sure.
But
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right word, but
yeah,
it's an example, obviously, of like they do actually break it down a lot just on their website now. They do, documents that get messier as you go, unclear outlines, disorganized research,
yeah. I got it.
breaking focus, anonymous elephants watching you, right? Like they call out all these specific pain
Yeah.
points that people have with Google Docs.
Like I would call myself a nerd and geek, but that's not
Yeah,
my stuff. I nerd out on different
sure.
things.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Before we wrap this up, I want to talk about a show
yeah.
that you've been watching recently. And I don't know if you've been
Mhm.
binging this show or whatever, but I think it's called Buying London. And
Yeah,
I think there was an episode that stood out to you about a certain house. And why did that episode
yeah.
stand out?
I just want to point out, though, before people tarnish me with like, oh, this guy's got awful taste in TV. He's talking about How I Met Your Mother, then he's talking about Buying London. Buying London is quite possibly one of the worst TV shows I've ever seen, but it hooks you in with, it's about real estate salespeople based in London, and they're selling homes for millions of pounds to celebrities, like Hollywood A-list celebrities.
Yeah.
You watch it because you're like, oh, I want to see what these houses are like, right? I want to see how the other half lives. And then you kind of stay into politics drama of The Office and people falling out. And you're like, oh, yeah, look at these people who think they've got it all together but actually hate each other and hate themselves. And it's kind of nice in that sense. Sort of like a punch it up kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was an episode where obviously they look around all these houses, and after a while all these houses start to blur together, right? I think this is the analogy that I was getting at, is all of these fancy houses, they all look luxurious, beautiful, lavish, but they're kind
Yeah.
of all the same when it really boils down to it, and it's still like once you've seen a few, you've seen them all kind of thing.
Especially if they were like over 100 years old. I'm imagining there's a lot of castles on the show, maybe. I
There
don't
were
know.
a
I
couple
mean,
of castles. Yeah, we don't all live in castles in England, but there were some castles. There were also like fancy houses in London where you're paying way too much for like two bedrooms, in my opinion. But
it's got like the middle
yeah, you know the
knob in the
ones.
door.
Yeah,
What's up
yeah,
with the
exactly.
middle knob? I mean, the middle
I
knob
don't
is
know.
really
I
hard
don't.
to
Yeah.
open and close. Who put the knob there?
I agree. You never know which hand to lead with. Do you go with both hands, just kind of like a cup it in both hands? I don't know. It's probably not even designed to be used, is it? You'd have a doorman that does that for you, I think. So yeah, you're not thinking wealthy enough. That's your problem. There was an episode with one house in particular that stuck in my head, which is that it actually had like a little annex building with a recording studio in. And I think it was owned by the guitarist or something from Roxy Music, which is some sort of band that is way, way before my time. And it had this little recording studio. I think Paul Weller was recording an album in there like the week before they were doing this tour of the house. And that's the one that stuck in my head. And I was thinking about this and I was like, the reason it stuck in my head is because there's a bit of a story behind it, right? It was owned by this musician and music producer. It's got a different feature to it, right? It's got a recording studio. None of the others had a recording studio.
Yeah.
So it has that point of difference and that narrative behind it. And I was like, that's a bit like SAS, right? It's not exactly the same, obviously, because we're talking about houses.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's in a similar vein. There's lots of products out there that blur together, like you mentioned with Asana and so on. They kind of blur into one. You've seen them all. But actually, if you have that narrative, it sticks out in the mind, like I was saying before, and that's the one you remember and keep coming back to. It might not even be the nicest house. That's also important. But it's the one that
Yeah.
you remember, right? And I think the best product isn't necessarily the one that wins. It's the one that tells the best story, in my opinion, is the one that wins.
So it reminds me of an episode of Seinfeld. George is looking to buy a car. He sees this used car. The salesman tells him, "Oh, John Voight owned this car." And John Voight, the
Right.
actor, and he's like, "Really?" He ends up buying the car, and all of his friends, John Voight used to own this car. Anyway, Jerry's looking through the glove box and he sees an old piece of paper and it's got John Voight's name on it, but it's spelled differently than the actor's name. So it was a different John Voight.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great example
Yeah.
as well of, I think one of the things, we probably don't have time to go into all of this detail, to be honest, but like one of the things that's really interesting is that storytelling in marketing isn't new, right? Like salespeople, marketers, they've known that this is how to do it, but it seems to have got lost, especially in B2B, where it's like, oh, it should all be about data and analytics, and it feels like marketers these days are really good at crunching numbers, but not so good at creating stories and doing the storytelling part, and it feels like a misstep, in my opinion, I suppose. which is why I'm trying to bring it back, bring back the storytelling.
Well, that's what you're hoping. That's why you're here. You're helping brands find their narrative. And I'm going to put a link to your LinkedIn profile and your website.
Cool.
You got to have a new website coming up soon called Spiel Agency, or at least a new design, right?
Yeah, I'm redesigning the website, a ton of different ideas, just cleaning it up a bit. I won't bore your listeners with the details of that, but hopefully by the time they listen to this and click through, it'll be a shiny new website. So they won't even necessarily know what the old one was, I suppose.
Joe, thanks for coming on Innovators Collab.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure. Everybody listening, if you enjoyed this, tell your friends about it, hit the subscribe button, and I'll be back next week. Until then, this is Eric signing off. Cheers.